Hello, everybody. We are going to read Chapter 13 of Winter According to Humphrey, Helping Hands. When Holly arrived the next morning, her dad was with her, and he was carrying a huge box. Slow Down Simon rushed up and asked, "What's that?" Soon, Holly and Mr. Hanson were surrounded by curious classmates. "Please, class, let Mr. Hanson get through so he can put the box down," Mrs. Brisbane said. They backed away, and Mr. Hanson set the box down on a table that Mrs. Brisbane had cleared for him. "But what is it?" Simon asked. "It's a present for the whole class," Holly said, "and I made it. And we're going to wait until everyone is here before we open it," Mrs. Brisbane said. Simon and the others groaned. "We'll have to wait forever for Harry." Harry and Simon were good friends, but Simon got annoyed when Harry was late, which was often. All my classmates were eager to find out what was in the box. Even though I knew what it was, I couldn't wait to see it either. Thankfully, by the time the bell rang, Harry was in his chair. After Mrs. Brisbane took attendance, she said, "Class, Holly has brought something special for everyone. I'll let her tell you about it." Holly stood next to the box on the table. "I wanted to make each of you a gift to celebrate the season, but I ended up making one gift for the whole class." "Open it already, please," Simon said. Holly carefully lifted the big lid, and my classmates gasped. "It's a gingerbread house, and I made it myself. Well, with some help from my mom." "Wow! Can we eat it?" Thomas asked. Holly looked horrified. "No, my mom sprayed something on it that would keep it from spoiling. It's not good to eat." "There will be no nibbling, class. Besides, we wouldn't want anything to ruin this beautiful house," Mrs. Brisbane said. "You did a wonderful job." "Can we see it closer?" Rolling Rosie asked. Mrs. Brisbane said that the students could come closer, but you must be very careful not to touch the house or shake the table. When they moved up, my friends blocked my view. "I'd like a better look too," I squeaked, but I'm sure no one heard me over all the talking. Boing! Og splashed wildly in his tank. "I want to live there," Kelsey said, leaning in. "Me too," Tall Paul agreed. "It reminds me of the witch's house in Hansel and Gretel," Phoebe said, "but much nicer." "There's a card that goes with it," Holly said. "It says, 'To all my friends in room 26, from Holly.'" "Thanks, Holly," Rosie said. "Thanks," all my friends chimed in. "Could you tell us how you made it, Holly?" Mrs. Brisbane asked. "Og, I wish I could get a better look," I squeaked. "Boing, boing, boing," Og agreed. I climbed all the way up to the tippy top of my cage and got a glimpse of the little house. It looked sweet. "My mom and I made the gingerbread," Holly explained. "Then we cut it in different shapes. We followed a pattern my dad made, and then we put it all together using icing as the glue." "Yum," Rosie said. "I needed my mom and dad to help with that. Then I put icing on the roof and put cookies on it to look like, what do you call those?" "Shingles," Mrs. Brisbane said. "Then I put all kinds of candy all over the house with candy canes on the chimney and around the door," said Holly. Holly continued. "Oh, and there are chocolate drops," Harry said. Kelsey pointed to something, and candy cane trees with gumdrops hanging from them. By this time, my friends were leaning over the little house. Mrs. Brisbane asked them to step back and not touch the table. "After all, Holly worked hard on this," she said. Everybody moved back when they admired the house. "I like the licorice stick fence," Small Paul said. "I like the cotton candy smoke coming out of the chimney," Phoebe said. They stood silently for a moment. Then Simon pointed and said, "Oh, look in the window." He leaned forward and pointed. "A gingerbread man." "There!" my friend shouted. My whiskers wiggled with excitement. But my excitement turned to shock when all at once my friends leaned forward to get a closer look. "Stop!" Mrs. Brisbane shouted, but it was too late. The table shook, the little house swayed from one side to the other, and then, crash! The gingerbread house collapsed into a heap. "Og, it's fallen to pieces," I squeaked to my neighbor. "Scree, scree," he replied. That's a sound he only makes in case of an emergency. Og was right. This was definitely emergency. "Oh, no," Holly moaned. "No." Mrs. Brisbane made everyone stand back. "Stay calm, everyone." Holly was not calm. Her face was red and tears started running down her face. "I'm so sorry this happened," Mrs. Brisbane said, giving Holly a hug. "You worked so hard on it. I should only have let one student at a time come up and look." "I'm sorry, Holly," Rosie said. "Me too," Thomas added. "It was the most beautiful house on earth." Small Paul stepped forward to look at the wreck of a house. "It's broken, but it's not smashed," he said. Holly wailed. Mrs. Brisbane asked Small Paul what he meant. "It might be possible to rebuild it," he said. Holly was sniffing so loudly I'm not sure she heard him. "Let's think about it," Mrs. Brisbane said, handing Holly a tissue. "Right now, it's time for math. Please go back to your seats." Then she began talking about multiplication. "Doesn't she care?" I asked Og. Boing! Og seemed as surprised as I was. Tears were still flowing down Holly's cheeks, and she began to hiccup. Sometimes it's funny to hear a human hiccup, but this time it wasn't funny at all. "Holly, why don't you go to the nurse's office and lie down for a while?" Mrs. Brisbane said. "I'll call her and tell her you're on the way." Holly nodded and left the room, loudly blowing her nose. Mrs. Brisbane wrote some math problems on the board, but I'm sure my friends weren't paying attention. "Can't we help her?" Kelsey whispered to Small Paul. He nodded. "There must be something we can do," Sophie whispered. Mrs. Brisbane turned to face the class. "What's going on?" she said. This isn't time for talking." Small Paul raised his hand. "We'd like to put that house back together," he said. Everybody agreed. "Yes," they said, "we want to help Holly." Me too, I squeaked. Mrs. Brisbane glanced at the clock. "All right, let's try. It's almost time for recess," she said. "Those of you who would like to work on the gingerbread house may stay in, but just this once." Small Paul started scribbling on a piece of paper. The bell for recess rang, and guess what? Everyone in the class decided to stay inside to rebuild the house. Everyone wanted to help Holly. Mrs. Brisbane had them gather around the table. Small Paul examined the broken pieces. "Luckily, when it collapsed, some of the bigger pieces didn't break," he explained. "So we should be able to glue them back together, and then we can put the candy pieces on again." "But we don't have that special icing," Rosie said. "Why don't we use real glue?" Tall Paul suggested. "We're not going to eat it anyway." Small Paul nodded, and real glue might hold it together better. They went to work quickly. The two Pauls and Mrs. Brisbane got the walls back up again and glued them. Kelsey and Phoebe put on the cookie roof. Thomas and Joey rebuilt the licorice fence. Rosie pieced the gingerbread men back together. Then the rest of my friends helped glue the candy back on. Everybody helped. I wished I could help too. At least I could encourage my friends. "Good job!" I shouted. "Boing, boing!" Og twanged. They were almost finished when the door swung open and Mrs. Wright walked in. She was bundled up in a thick jacket and had a scarf wrapped around her neck. But I could still see her whistle hanging from her neck. "Mrs. Brisbane, what are your students doing inside? You know they're supposed to go out for recess," she said. "The rules say—" Mrs. Brisbane is usually polite, but this time she interrupted Mrs. Wright. "I know the rules," she said, "but we had an emergency in the class." She explained about the gingerbread house, the accident, and how upset Holly was. "I think we can break the rules just this once so my students can help a friend who's in pain, don't you?" Mrs. Brisbane smiled. I could see that Mrs. Wright was surprised, but then she shocked me. I think so, she said. She looked at her watch. You better get back to work. Recess will be over soon. And she left without blowing her whistle even once. By the time the bell rang, the house was put together again. To squeak the truth, it didn't look quite the same. Even from my cage, I could see that it was a little crooked, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that the whole class had worked together to help Holly. A few minutes after my classmates were back in their seats, the door opened and Holly came in. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying anymore. "Welcome back," Mrs. Brisbane said with a smile. "We have a little surprise for you," and she pointed at the gingerbread house. Holly's eyes were wide as she hurried to the table. "But who? I mean, what? I don't think Holly knew what she meant. "All your classmates wanted to help you, Holly, so during recess they put the house back together," Mrs. Brisbane explained. Holly stared down at the little house. I was afraid she was going to cry again, but instead she smiled. "You did this to help me?" she said, turning to the class. "Sure, Holly," Kelsey said. "You're always helping us." All my friends were smiling and nodding, including me. "You gave your friends a gift," Mrs. Brisbane said, "and they gave you a gift back." "Thank you," Holly said. I had a warm feeling from the ends of my whiskers to the tip of my tail. Humphrey's Winter Wanderings. I wonder if a gingerbread man puts a cookie sheet on his bed. Well, thank you for listening, and we'll see you later.